I don't date janitors. A rich woman cruelly rejects a single dad at a gala, but when her car breaks down and only he stops to help, her entire world is turned upside down because behind his quiet strength lies a secret that could shatter her pride forever. Will she cling to status or risk everything for the kind of love money can't buy? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the grand ballroom of the Riverside Historic Hotel. Vivian Hawthorne stood near the entrance, her silver evening gown catching the light as she surveyed the crowd with practiced confidence. Her perfectly styled gray hair and elegant posture commanded attention, just the way she liked it. "Darling," called Margaret Wellington, lifting her champagne flute in greeting. "You look absolutely divine tonight." Vivian made her way through the well-dressed crowd, nodding graciously to familiar faces. The annual Spring Charity Gala was one of the most prestigious events in town, and she'd served on its board for the past decade. "Margaret, Caroline," Vivian acknowledged her friends with a practiced smile. "The decorations are lovely this year." Caroline Peterson dabbed at her lipstick with a napkin. "Indeed, though I must say, they had the most peculiar help setting up. Isn't that the janitor from Pine Grove Elementary?" Vivian followed Caroline's subtle head tilt toward the far corner of the room. There stood a tall man in a slightly ill-fitting suit, adjusting one of the flower arrangements. Even in formal wear, there was no disguising Eli Carter's working-class bearing. "How interesting that they'd have him here," Vivian remarked, sipping her champagne. Margaret lowered her voice. "Well, I heard he volunteers for several charity organizations. Probably trying to network his way up, if you ask me." Vivian watched as Eli moved carefully through the crowd. His movements reserved but dignified. There was something about his quiet presence that seemed to carry its own kind of grace, though she quickly dismissed the thought. The orchestra struck up a new waltz, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. Vivian found herself alone for a moment, her friends having drifted away to mingle. She was studying the elaborate ice sculpture when she felt someone approach. "Excuse me, Mrs. Hawthorne?" The voice was soft but clear. Vivian turned to find Eli Carter standing before her, his hands clasped politely in front of him. Up close, she could see the slight wear on his suit jacket's cuffs and the earnest expression in his warm brown eyes. "Yes," she replied, her tone cooling instinctively. Eli cleared his throat quietly. I was wondering if you might like to dance?" The question hung in the air between them. Vivian felt her chest tighten as she noticed several of her friends watching the exchange with poorly concealed interest. The mere thought of being seen dancing with the school janitor made her cheeks burn. "I don't date janitors," she said, her voice sharp and dismissive. The words came out before she could fully consider their cruelty. She saw the impact of her words register in his eyes, not anger, but a deep hurt that he quickly tried to mask. Around them, she heard a few quiet snickers from her social circle. "Of course. My apologies for disturbing you," Eli replied softly. His dignity in the face of her contempt somehow made it worse. He gave a slight bow and turned away, making his way through the crowd with measured steps. Vivian watched him go, an unexpected heaviness settling in her stomach. She caught sight of her reflection in one of the ballroom's giant mirrors, elegant, sophisticated, and suddenly looking very small. "Can you believe the nerve?" Caroline had materialized at her side, shaking her head. "Really, where does he think he is?" "Quite right," Margaret chimed in. "You handled that perfectly, Vivian. We must maintain standards after all." Vivian forced a smile and raised her champagne glass, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling in her chest. "Yes, well, shall we check on the silent auction items?" As her friends led the way toward the display tables, Vivian glanced back once more. Through the crowd, she caught a final glimpse of Eli quietly slipping out through the ballroom's heavy doors. Something about his departing figure, straight-backed yet somehow wounded, stirred an emotion she couldn't quite name. She turned back to her companions, determined to lose herself in their familiar chatter, but as the evening wore on, that small voice of conscience kept whispering, making it harder to enjoy the sparkle and shine of her carefully curated world. "More champagne, dear?" Margaret offered, gesturing to a passing waiter. "Yes, thank you," Vivian replied, perhaps a bit too quickly. She took a long sip, trying to wash away the memory of Eli's hurt expression. The bubbles felt flat on her tongue. Around her, the gala continued in full swing. Ladies in designer gowns twirled across the dance floor, jewelry glinting under the chandeliers. Men in expensive suits discussed business deals and golf scores. It was her world, comfortable and predictable. Yet somehow the glamour felt slightly tarnished tonight. Caroline touched her arm. "Vivian, the auction is about to close. Weren't you interested in that lovely painting?" "What?" "Oh yes," Vivian said, straightening her shoulders and plastering on her social smile. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, nodding to acquaintances, making the expected small talk. But each time she caught her reflection in the ballroom's mirrors, she saw something that made her want to look away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and social obligations. Vivian played her part perfectly, the wealthy widow, the social leader, the tastemaker. Yet beneath her poised exterior, that small voice of conscience refused to be silenced completely. As the gala began to wind down, she found herself standing near the spot where Eli had made his request. The orchestra was playing a slower number now, the same waltz it had been playing earlier. Vivian stood alone, swirling the last of her champagne, trying to brush off the unease that had settled over her like a fine dust. "Shall we head to the Willows Club for a nightcap?" Margaret suggested, gathering her wrap. Vivian hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, let's do that." She followed her friends toward the exit, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Better to surround herself with the familiar, to drown out that persistent whisper of conscience with more champagne and comfortable conversation. Yet, even as she stepped into the cool night air, Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted this evening. Something that all the social niceties in the world couldn't quite make right. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the winding country road. As Vivian guided her Mercedes away from the Willow Creek Country Club, her fingers drummed against the leather steering wheel, her jaw still tight from her argument with Caroline over the upcoming hospital fundraiser. 20 years of experience? Indeed, Vivian muttered, remembering Caroline's condescending tone, as if she could organize a bake sale, let alone a charity auction. The car's climate control hummed softly, keeping the spring heat at bay. Vivian had chosen this scenic route home specifically to avoid traffic and clear her head. Rolling hills stretched out on either side, dotted with old farmhouses and patches of woodland. The first sign of trouble came with a slight shudder in the engine. Vivian frowned, easing off the accelerator. The car lurched, then coughed, the dashboard lighting up like a Christmas tree. No, no, no. She guided the failing vehicle toward the shoulder, her heart beginning to race. The engine gave one final sputter before dying completely, leaving her stranded on the narrow road's edge. Vivian reached for her phone, only to find the screen showing a single bar of service that kept flickering in and out. She tried calling her mechanic anyway, but the call wouldn't connect. Perfect. Just perfect. She dropped the phone into her lap and watched as a red pickup truck zoomed past without slowing. A blue sedan followed suit, then a minivan. The minutes ticked by. Each passing vehicle stirred up dust that settled on her pristine car. Vivian's frustration mounted as driver after driver ignored her predicament. She'd always assumed people would stop to help someone in a luxury car. Surely they'd expect a reward. But no one even tapped their brakes. The sun dipped lower, casting orange light through the trees. Vivian's anxiety began to climb. She wasn't used to feeling this helpless, this vulnerable. A sports car roared past, its driver not even glancing her way. Just as she was considering trying to walk to the nearest house, she heard the rumble of an older engine approaching. In her rearview mirror, she saw a weathered blue truck slow down and pull onto the shoulder behind her. Her relief quickly turned to dismay when she recognized the figure stepping out of the truck. Even in the fading light, there was no mistaking Eli Carter's tall frame and measured movements. Vivian's cheeks burned as she remembered their encounter at the gala just yesterday. Of all the people who could have stopped to help, it had to be the man she'd so cruelly dismissed. He approached her window, which she reluctantly lowered. "Having trouble with your car, Mrs. Hawthorne?" His voice held no trace of resentment, just simple concern. Yes," she managed, fighting the urge to look away from his kind eyes. "It just died while I was driving. Mind if I take a look?" He was already rolling up the sleeves of his work shirt, revealing strong forearms marked with the occasional scar. The hands of someone who knew real work. Vivian popped the hood, and Eli moved to the front of the car. She could hear him working, the occasional metallic clink accompanied by thoughtful humming. "Try starting it now," he called after a few minutes. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. Eli returned to the hood, his movements sure and methodical. The sky darkened further, and he pulled out a flashlight from his pocket, continuing his work. More vehicles passed, their headlights briefly illuminating the scene. A wealthy woman in designer clothes sitting helplessly while a janitor worked to save her evening. The irony wasn't lost on Vivian. "One more try," Eli said after what seemed like ages. This time when Vivian turned the key, the engine purred to life, smooth as ever. Eli closed the hood and approached her window again, wiping his hands on a rag. "Your alternator belt was loose. I've tightened it up, but you'll want to have your mechanic check it properly tomorrow." I thank you, Vivian said, reaching for her purse. Please, let me pay you for your trouble. Eli held up a hand, shaking his head. No need for that, Mrs. Hawthorne. Just glad I could help. The genuine warmth in his smile made her chest tight with shame. Here was the man she deemed beneath her, refusing payment for helping her out of genuine kindness. Drive safely now, he said, giving a small wave as he turned back to his truck. Vivian watched in her rearview mirror as Eli's old truck pulled away, its taillights growing smaller in the gathering dusk. She sat there for several long moments, her engine idling, struck by the stark contrast between her behavior yesterday and his today. The dying sunlight caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked polished and put together as always, but somehow, sitting alone in her expensive car, she felt smaller than she had in years. The late September breeze rustled through the maple trees, lining Carson Elementary School's walkway, as Vivian Hawthorne made her way toward the entrance. Her heels clicked against the concrete, each step measured and purposeful. She'd promised the hospital board she'd make an appearance at this fundraiser, though spending her Thursday afternoon at a children's art fair wasn't exactly her idea of time well spent. Paper streamers and balloon arches transformed the school gymnasium into a carnival of color. Children's artwork lined the walls, their creativity splashed across construction paper in bold strokes and bright hues. The air hummed with excited chatter and the squeak of tennis shoes on polished floors. Vivian smoothed her silk blouse and managed a polite smile as parents and teachers nodded in her direction. Her presence here was expected. After all, she chaired 3 different charity boards in town. But something felt different today. The usual satisfaction of being seen doing good works felt hollow. Near the far wall, a familiar figure caught her eye. Eli Carter stood on a stepladder, helping a group of children hang their freshly painted banner. His movements were patient and careful as he guided tiny hands, making sure each child got a chance to contribute. He wore his usual work uniform, but there was nothing common about the genuine warmth in his smile as he encouraged the young artists. A little higher on the left, he suggested softly to a small boy with glasses. There you go, perfect. Vivian found herself watching longer than she intended. The scene stirred something unexpected in her chest, a mix of admiration and discomfort she couldn't quite name. The memory of their last encounter on that dark road still pricked at her conscience. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the small whirlwind approaching until it crashed right into her legs. A little girl with wild curls and bright eyes looked up at her, face lighting up with pure joy. "It's you!" the child exclaimed, wrapping her arms around Vivian's knees. "Daddy has your picture." Vivian froze, caught completely off guard by this tiny assault of affection. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I think you must have me confused with—" "Mommy says you're my daddy's special friend," Grace Carter announced loudly enough for nearby parents to turn and look. Her innocent voice carried across the gymnasium floor. "I saw you in the pretty silver frame." A ripple of amused laughter spread through the crowd. Vivian felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized what was happening. Eli was already hurrying over, his face a mix of mortification and concern. "Grace, honey," he said gently, reaching for his daughter's hand. I'm so sorry, Miss Hawthorne. She must have seen a photo of her mother. Sarah had similar coloring to you and from a child's perspective." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable, but Grace wasn't done. She tugged at Vivian's hand, her small fingers warm and insistent. "You look just like the lady in Daddy's special box, the one he says watches over us from heaven now." The gymnasium seemed to grow very quiet. Vivian felt something crack in her carefully maintained facade. The child's words, so pure and mistaken, touched a place in her heart she thought had long since hardened over. "Grace," Eli said softly, kneeling beside his daughter. "Remember we talked about Mommy? This is Miss Hawthorne. She's different from the pictures you saw." Grace's face scrunched up in confusion, then fell slightly. "Oh." She looked up at Vivian again, this time more carefully. "But you're still pretty like her." More chuckles from the onlookers, but they were gentle now, touched by the moment's innocence. Vivian found herself smiling despite her embarrassment, drawn in by the child's openness. "Thank you, sweetheart," she managed, her voice softer than usual. "That's very kind of you to say." Eli stood, still holding Grace's hand. "Miss Hawthorne, I apologize again. Grace sometimes gets carried away with her imagination." "Please, don't apologize," Vivian said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "Children see the world in their own special way, don't they?" Grace beamed up at her, apparently having already forgotten her mistake. "Want to see my painting? I made a butterfly. Daddy helped with the spots, but I did all the wings myself." Before Vivian could respond, the little girl was pulling her toward a display of student artwork. Eli followed, shaking his head with a mixture of amusement and resignation. Grace, Miss Hawthorne probably needs to. It's all right, Vivian heard herself say. I'd love to see your butterfly. For the next few minutes, she found herself drawn into Grace's world of art and imagination. The child's enthusiasm was infectious as she pointed out every detail of her creation, from the carefully painted wings to the slightly wobbly antennae. Eli stood nearby, watching his daughter with obvious pride and love. Occasionally, his eyes met Vivian's, and in those brief moments, she saw something that made her chest tighten: gratitude, warmth, and a hint of something else she couldn't quite define. Finally, Grace was called away by her teacher for the next activity, leaving Vivian and Eli in an awkward but somehow comfortable silence. She's quite something, Vivian said quietly. She is, Eli agreed. She has her mother's heart, sees the good in everyone. He paused, then added softly, Thank you for being kind about the mix-up. She still misses her mom something fierce sometimes. Vivian nodded, unable to find the right words. The weight of her previous behavior toward this man pressed against her conscience. A call for volunteers to help with face painting drew Eli away, and Vivian found herself alone again in the crowded gymnasium. But something had shifted. The carefully constructed walls of her social position felt less solid, less important. She made her way toward the exit, her designer heels clicking against the floor that Eli probably polished himself. Grace's innocent words echoed in her mind. Mommy says you're my daddy's special friend. Such a simple mistake, yet it had cracked open a door she hadn't even known was there. The afternoon sun was warm on her face as she stepped outside, but it was the lingering warmth in her heart that surprised her most. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Vivian Hawthorne felt something real, something that had nothing to do with social standing or proper appearances. She paused at her car, the sounds of children's laughter drifting through the school's open windows. The memory of Grace's bright eyes and Eli's gentle patience followed her, refusing to be dismissed as easily as she had once dismissed him. The chandelier-lit dining room of the Riverside Country Club sparkled with polished silverware and crystal glasses. Vivian sat at her usual table, surrounded by 4 of her closest acquaintances. The familiar setting should have been comfortable, yet something felt off-kilter today. Margaret Blackwood, her silver hair swept into an immaculate updo, dabbed her lips with a napkin. Did anyone notice that janitor hanging around the school fundraiser last week? The one who keeps appearing at our events? Oh, you mean Eli Carter? Patricia Reynolds set down her water glass. I saw him helping with decorations. Rather presumptuous of him to think he belongs at these functions, don't you think? Vivian's fork paused halfway to her mouth. The salmon suddenly tasted like cardboard. Speaking of presumptuous, Barbara Chen leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. I heard he actually asked someone to dance at the charity gala. Can you imagine? Heat crept up Vivian's neck. She took a long sip of water, trying to wash away the memory of her cruel dismissal. Well, he certainly aims high, doesn't he? Margaret's laugh tinkled like ice in a glass. A janitor thinking he can mix with our crowd. It's almost sad. His daughter's sweet, though, said Janet Moore, the youngest of their group. I've seen her at school. Grace, I think her name is? Poor thing, Patricia shook her head. Being raised by just a janitor. No mother figure, no proper guidance. She'll probably end up cleaning floors too. The words hit Vivian like a physical blow. She remembered Grace's innocent face, her bright eyes when she'd mistaken Vivian for her mother. The same cruel judgment she'd once delivered now felt like poison in the air. Actually, Vivian heard herself say, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Eli Carter is quite capable. He fixed my car last week when it broke down. 4 pairs of eyes turned to her in surprise. Your car? Barbara's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. Why didn't you call roadside assistance? He happened to be passing by, Vivian replied. He was very professional and wouldn't accept payment. Oh, darling. Margaret patted her hand condescendingly. Of course he wouldn't take money from you directly. He's probably planning to use it to his advantage somehow. These people always have angles. These people? The words tasted bitter in Vivian's mouth. He's hardworking and decent, and his daughter is delightful. A heavy silence fell over the table. Janet's eyes widened, while Barbara and Patricia exchanged meaningful glances. Vivian, Margaret said carefully, you're not getting involved with him, are you? What? No, Vivian felt her cheeks flush. I'm simply stating facts. Why shouldn't we acknowledge someone's good qualities? My dear, Patricia leaned forward, her voice dripping with concern. We're just looking out for you. You have a certain position to maintain. Your late husband would have wanted me to be honest, Vivian cut in, surprising herself with the sharp edge in her voice. The conversation shifted awkwardly to safer topics: the upcoming hospital fundraiser, someone's daughter's engagement, the new restaurant downtown. But Vivian felt the undercurrent of whispers and sidelong glances. She disrupted their carefully maintained social order, and they didn't quite know what to make of it. Later that afternoon, Vivian stood in her marble-floored foyer, staring at her reflection in the ornate mirror. The woman looking back at her wore a perfectly tailored dress and an expression of confusion. Her carefully maintained facade seemed to be cracking, revealing something underneath she didn't quite recognize. "Why do you care?" she whispered to her reflection. "He's just a janitor." But even as the words left her mouth, they felt hollow. She remembered Eli's quiet dignity as he fixed her car, asking nothing in return. The gentle way he'd handled Grace's mistake at the school, his embarrassed but warm smile. The man had shown more grace in their few encounters than she'd witnessed in countless charity galas and social functions. Vivian turned away from the mirror, her heels echoing in the empty house. The space that had once felt elegant now seemed cavernous and cold. She couldn't shake the image of Grace's bright face, or the memory of Eli's hurt expression at the gala when she dismissed him so cruelly. She walked to her living room window, looking out at her manicured gardens. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfect lawn, and somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter floated on the breeze. Vivian wrapped her arms around herself, feeling strangely restless in her perfectly ordered world. "Why do you care?" she asked again, softer this time. But the answer seemed to hover just beyond her reach, like a truth she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Vivian Hawthorne's heels clicked against the polished floor of Morton's grocery store, a place she usually sent her housekeeper to handle such mundane tasks. Today, though, she found herself drawn to do her own shopping, perhaps seeking a change from her usual routine. The fluorescent lights cast an unfamiliar glow on the pristine aisles, making everything seem both ordinary and strange. She consulted a hastily written list, feeling somewhat out of place among the weekend shoppers with their casual attire and loaded carts. Her silk blouse and pearls seemed overdressed for this setting, but old habits died hard. As she reached for a box of premium tea, a familiar voice pierced through the ambient store music. "Miss Hawthorne, Miss Hawthorne." Grace Carter's excited call echoed down the aisle, her small shoes pattering against the floor as she rushed forward. The little girl's face lit up with genuine delight, her ponytail bouncing with each step. Eli appeared behind her, pushing a cart filled with modest groceries, his expression warm but slightly uncertain. "Grace, honey, don't run in the store," Eli gently reminded his daughter, though his eyes crinkled with affection. "Sorry, Daddy." Grace skidded to a stop near Vivian, beaming up at her. "Look, we're getting groceries too. Do you like Fruit Loops? They're my favorite, but Daddy says we can only get them sometimes because they have too much sugar." Vivian found herself chuckling at the girl's enthusiasm. "Well, I've never actually tried Fruit Loops," she admitted, surprising herself with her candor. Grace's eyes widened in disbelief. "Never? But they're the best. They make the milk turn all rainbow colors." Eli stepped closer, his cart squeaking slightly. "I'm sorry if we're bothering you, Miss Hawthorne." "Grace, let's give Miss Hawthorne space to do her shopping." "Oh no," Vivian heard herself say. "It's no bother at all." She looked at their cart, noticing the careful way Eli checked prices and chose store brands. Something shifted in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Grace bounced on her toes, pointing to the cereal aisle. "Can I show Miss Hawthorne the Fruit Loops, Daddy, please?" Eli hesitated, but Vivian surprised them both by saying, "I'd love to see them, if that's all right with your father." They moved to the cereal aisle, Grace leading the way with the authority of a tiny tour guide. She reached for the bright box, standing on tiptoes. "See, they're really good. And look, there's a maze on the back." Vivian watched as Grace's small finger traced the maze on the box, her face scrunched in concentration. Without thinking, she said, "Why don't you let me get that for you today?" Eli straightened, his pride visible in his stance. "That's very kind, but we couldn't." "Please?" Vivian said softly, surprising herself with a genuine warmth in her voice. "It would make me happy." Grace looked between the adults, holding the cereal box like a treasure. Eli's resistance softened as he saw the hopeful look in his daughter's eyes. "What do we say when someone offers something nice?" he prompted Grace. "Thank you, Miss Hawthorne." Grace hugged the box to her chest. "Can I show you my other favorite things?" For the next 15 minutes, Vivian found herself being led through the store by an enthusiastic 8-year-old, learning about the merits of different cookie brands and why the strawberry yogurt was better than the blueberry. Eli followed with their cart, occasionally adding gentle corrections to Grace's excited commentary. "The purple package has the best cookies," Grace explained seriously. "But Daddy says we have to stick to our list today." Vivian glanced at Eli, seeing the slight flush on his cheeks. Without making a show of it, she reached for the purple package. "Well, I think I might try these myself. Would you mind if I shared some with you both?" Eli started to protest, but Grace's joy was infectious. "That's very generous of you," he finally said, his voice warm with gratitude. At the checkout counter, Vivian insisted on paying for the treats, while Eli handled their regular groceries. The cashier smiled at Grace's excited chatter about their unexpected meeting. In the parking lot, Eli loaded their bags into his old truck while Grace carefully held the special treats. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the lot. "Thank you again, Miss Hawthorne," Eli said, his quiet dignity touching something deep within her. "You've made her day." "Please, call me Vivian," she found herself saying. "And thank you both for making my shopping trip so much more enjoyable than I expected." Grace waved enthusiastically from the passenger window as Eli started the truck. "Bye, Miss Vivian. Thank you for the Fruit Loops." Vivian stood by her car, watching as their old truck pulled away. She realized she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in years. It wasn't the polished social smile she wore at galas or the satisfied smirk of closing a deal. This was something different, something real that started in her chest and worked its way to her face naturally. She touched her cheeks, almost surprised to feel them lifted in genuine joy. The simple pleasure of buying cereal and cookies for a child had somehow brightened her whole day. The thought of Grace's excitement over showing her favorite treats and Eli's gracious acceptance of her small kindness warmed her heart in a way her usual social circles never did. The cream-colored invitation sat on Vivian's mahogany desk, its simple design a stark contrast to the elaborate party invitations she usually received. "Spring Garden Project, Jefferson Elementary School," it read in modest lettering. She picked it up, running her manicured fingers over the recycled paper. "How did this even get here?" she muttered, though she suspected Margaret, her friend on the school board, had something to do with it. Normally, Vivian would have dropped such an invitation straight into her wastebasket. Manual labor in a school garden? Not her typical Thursday afternoon activity, but something made her pause. Perhaps it was Grace's bright smile from their grocery store encounter that flashed in her mind, or the memory of Eli's quiet dignity as he fixed her car that night. Whatever the reason, Vivian found herself reaching for her phone. "Margaret? Yes, I'll be there tomorrow." The next afternoon, Vivian pulled into the school parking lot in her Mercedes, feeling decidedly overdressed in her casual designer outfit, which for her meant crisp white pants and a silk blouse. Other volunteers were already gathering near the garden plot, wearing well-worn jeans and t-shirts. "Mrs. Hawthorne!" Grace's voice carried across the schoolyard. The little girl bounded toward her, brown pigtails bouncing, wearing tiny overalls covered in cartoon flowers. "You came. Daddy said you might be too busy, but I told him you'd come." Vivian's chest tightened at the child's unrestrained joy. "Well, hello to you too, Grace," she said, managing a warm smile. Eli appeared behind his daughter, wearing faded jeans and a plain blue t-shirt that showed years of wash. He nodded politely. "Mrs. Hawthorne, this island. Unexpected. Please call me Vivian," she found herself saying. "And yes, I suppose at Island." The garden project coordinator, a cheerful woman named Susan, divided everyone into teams. Somehow, though Vivian suspected it wasn't entirely by chance, she ended up working alongside Eli and Grace in the butterfly garden section. "Like this, Mrs. Vivian," Grace demonstrated, her small hands confidently digging into the soil. "You make a hole, put in the flower, then pat the dirt around it like you're tucking it into bed." Vivian hesitated, then knelt down beside her. Her white pants would never be the same, but something about Grace's enthusiasm made that seem suddenly unimportant. She copied the little girl's movements, planting a purple coneflower. "That's perfect," Grace beamed. As they worked, conversation flowed naturally. Grace chattered about her favorite subjects in school, her pet goldfish named Sparkles, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian. Eli mostly listened, occasionally adding quiet comments or gentle reminders to his daughter about proper planting depth. During a water break, while Grace helped Susan distribute snacks to the other volunteers, Eli and Vivian found themselves alone by the butterfly bushes. "She's quite something, your daughter," Vivian said, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Eli's face softened. "She's everything to me. Makes every hard day worth it." "Hard days?" Vivian found herself asking. Eli was quiet for a moment, his hands working the soil. "After Sarah, my wife, passed away 3 years ago, there were plenty of those. Still are. Being both mom and dad, working 2 jobs sometimes to make ends meet." He shrugged. But Grace never complains. She just loves, purely and completely. Vivian watched him carefully pat soil around a lantana plant. His movements were gentle but sure, like everything else he did. 2 jobs? She asked. The school during the day, then night maintenance at the hospital 3 times a week. Grace stays with my sister those nights. His voice held no self-pity, just statement of fact. We make it work. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Vivian found herself laughing at Grace's silly jokes, learning the proper way to mulch from Eli, and actually enjoying the feeling of accomplishment as their section of the garden took shape. Her silk blouse was spotted with dirt. Her perfectly styled hair had escaped its clip, but she felt strangely free. They planted marigolds, zinnias, and butterfly bushes. Grace insisted on naming each plant, creating elaborate stories about their plant families. Vivian found herself drawn into these tales, suggesting names and adding to the stories, much to Grace's delight. Mrs. Violet and Mr. Sunflower are having a garden party, Grace declared, arranging stones around a cluster of purple and yellow blooms. And everyone's invited, even the weeds. That's very inclusive of you, Vivian said, smiling despite herself. Sarah taught her that, Eli said softly. Everyone deserves a seat at the table, she used to say. The sun was beginning to set when Susan called an end to the day's work. The garden had been transformed. Neat rows of flowers and vegetables promised future beauty and bounty. Vivian stood up, her back aching pleasantly from the unaccustomed labor. Thank you, Eli said suddenly, his voice sincere, for coming today. It meant a lot to Grace, and... He paused. It was nice working with you. Vivian nodded, suddenly unable to find the right words. Grace wrapped her arms around Vivian's waist in a quick hug before skipping off to say goodbye to her friend. Driving home in her luxury car, Vivian glanced down at her ruined outfit. Dirt streaked the white pants, and her blouse would never be the same. Yet, as she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, she noticed something different. Her cheeks were flushed with healthy color, and her eyes seemed brighter. Despite the physical fatigue, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. Vivian's heels clicked against the polished school hallway floor as she balanced a box of carefully selected children's books in her arms. The familiar scent of chalk dust and floor cleaner filled the air, bringing back memories of her own school days, though her private academy had smelled more of leather-bound books and wood polish. Through the classroom windows, morning sunlight streamed in warm patches across the worn carpet. A week had passed since the garden project, and here she was again, drawn back to Jefferson Elementary like a leaf caught in a gentle current. Here, let me help you with that. Eli's voice came from behind her, steady and warm. Before she could protest, he lifted the heavy box from her arms with ease. Thank you, Vivian said, smoothing her pencil skirt. I was going through some old things and thought these might be useful. It wasn't entirely true. She'd spend an evening at the bookstore, carefully choosing titles she thought the children might enjoy. The kids will love these. Eli's eyes crinkled at the corners as he peeked into the box. Grace especially, she's quite the bookworm. As if summoned by her name, Grace burst out of her classroom, her face lighting up at the sight of Vivian. You came back! She wrapped her arms around Vivian's waist, catching her off guard with the spontaneous display of affection. Grace, Eli cautioned gently, remember what we said about personal space? Oh, sorry. Grace stepped back, but her smile didn't dim. But Mrs. Hawthorne doesn't mind, right? She looked up at Vivian with hopeful eyes. Something in Vivian's chest softened. No, I don't mind at all. The words surprised her as much as they delighted Grace. Can I show you my classroom, and the library, and the art room where we made clay animals last week? Grace's enthusiasm bubbled over as she tugged at Vivian's hand. Now, sweetheart, Eli started, but Vivian cut in. I'd love to see everything. She found herself meaning it. That is, if it's all right with your father? Eli nodded, adjusting the box in his arms. I need to get these books sorted anyway. Take your time. Grace proved to be an enthusiastic tour guide, pulling Vivian from one room to the next. This is where I sit, she announced proudly in her classroom, pointing to a desk decorated with butterfly stickers. And look, I got an A on my spelling test. Vivian bent to examine the paper Grace thrust toward her, covered in careful second-grade handwriting. That's wonderful, she said, and meant it. In the art room, Grace showed her a slightly lopsided clay cat painted in bright orange. Daddy has it on his desk at home, she explained. I made it because we can't have a real cat in our apartment. Each revelation about their life touched something in Vivian she thought had calcified long ago. The pride in Grace's voice, when she spoke about her father, the way she didn't seem to notice or care that her clothes were from discount stores. the pure joy she took in simple things. It all struck Vivian as somehow more real than the artificial pleasantries of her usual social circle. They found Eli in the library, carefully arranging the new books on a shelf. He looked up as they entered, and something in his expression when he saw them together made Vivian's heart skip. "Having fun?" he asked, directing the question to both of them. "Mrs. Hawthorne likes my clay cat," Grace announced. "Can she come see the real one at the shelter sometime, please?" Eli's eyes met Vivian's. "That's up to Mrs. Hawthorne," he said carefully. "I volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends," he explained to Vivian. "Grace comes with me sometimes." "You volunteer?" Vivian couldn't hide her surprise. Here was a man who worked long hours as a janitor, raised a daughter alone, and still found time to help animals in need. "Someone has to," he said simply, no pretense in his voice. "The animals need care, and Grace loves helping." "I help feed the kittens," Grace added proudly. Vivian found herself imagining it. Eli and Grace spending their weekends caring for abandoned animals, finding joy in giving rather than receiving. It was so different from her own weekends of charity, galas, and social obligations, where the giving was more about being seen than making a difference. They fell into easy conversation as Eli finished shelving the books, Grace occasionally chiming in with stories about school or the shelter. Vivian was surprised to discover how comfortable it felt, this simple interaction without the usual social maneuvering she was accustomed to. When it was time to leave, Grace hugged her again, and this time Vivian returned the embrace without hesitation. "Thank you for the books," Eli said softly as he walked her to the door. "They'll make a real difference here." "It was nothing," Vivian demurred, but they both knew it wasn't nothing. It was something. Something neither of them quite had words for yet. Driving home in her Mercedes, Vivian told herself this was just volunteering, just giving back to the community. The warm glow in her chest when she thought of Grace's hugs and Eli's gentle smile, that was just satisfaction from doing a good deed. Nothing more. But as she passed the animal shelter on her way home, she found herself slowing down, wondering what it would be like to spend a weekend there instead of at another meaningless social function. The thought surprised her, and she quickly accelerated past the building. Back in her elegant home, surrounded by expensive furnishings and perfect silence, Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The quiet that had once felt peaceful now seemed empty compared to Grace's laughter and Eli's warm voice. "It's just volunteering," she said aloud to her reflection in the hallway mirror, but her heart knew better. It whispered of something deeper, something that scared and thrilled her in equal measure. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the school playground as Vivian helped Grace pack up her backpack after another successful reading session. Over the past week, she had found herself spending more and more time at the school, drawn by the simple joy of helping children learn and the warm presence of the Carters. "Miss Vivian?" Grace looked up at her with those big brown eyes that seemed to hold all the innocence in the world. "Would you like to come have dinner with us tonight?" Vivian's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Eli, who was sweeping nearby, his movements pausing at his daughter's words. A slight flush colored his cheeks. "Grace," he said gently, "Miss Hawthorne probably has other plans. But Daddy, you make the best spaghetti, and I want to show her my room and my drawings, and—" "It's okay," Vivian found herself saying, surprising even herself. "I'd love to come, if you're sure it's not an imposition." Eli's eyes met hers, and after a moment's hesitation, his face softened into a smile. "We'd be honored to have you." Later that evening, Vivian pulled up to their modest, single-story home in her Mercedes, feeling oddly nervous. The house was small but well-maintained, with cheerful yellow curtains in the windows and carefully tended flower boxes. She smoothed her silk blouse, wondering if she was overdressed for a simple family dinner. Grace burst out the front door before Vivian could even ring the bell. "You came! You came!" She grabbed Vivian's hand, pulling her inside with infectious enthusiasm. The interior was warm and lived in, with mismatched furniture that somehow worked together. Family photos lined the walls, many featuring a beautiful young woman with Grace's smile. Her mother, Vivian realized with a pang. "This is my art corner." Grace proudly showed off a small desk covered in crayons and construction paper. "And look, I drew us." She held up a crayon drawing of 3 figures, a tall man in blue, clearly Eli, a small girl in pink, Grace, and a woman in purple, unmistakably Vivian, holding hands. Vivian blinked back unexpected tears. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." From the kitchen came the appetizing smell of garlic and tomatoes. Eli appeared in the doorway wearing an apron, looking slightly sheepish. Dinner's almost ready. It's nothing fancy. It smells wonderful, Vivian assured him. The dining table was small and wooden, marked with years of use, but scrubbed clean. Mismatched plates were set out with care, and a jar of wildflowers served as a centerpiece. It was so different from Vivian's formal dining room, with its crystal chandelier and matching china, yet somehow more inviting. Grace insisted on sitting next to Vivian, chattering happily as Eli served generous portions of spaghetti and meatballs. The sauce, Vivian learned, was his mother's recipe. "Would you like to say grace?" Eli asked Grace, who nodded seriously. Vivian found herself joining hands with them, touched by the simple prayer of thanksgiving that followed. When was the last time she'd held hands with anyone? The meal was delicious, far better than many expensive restaurant dinners she'd had lately. But it wasn't just the food. It was the way Grace giggled when sauce dotted her chin, the warm glances Eli gave his daughter, the easy conversation that flowed between them all. "Miss Vivian," Grace said between bites, "you're like a second mom to me now. Is that okay?" The words hit Vivian like a physical force. She set down her fork, emotion closing her throat. Eli started to apologize, but Vivian shook her head. That's more than okay, sweetheart," she managed, her voice thick. A tear escaped despite her best efforts, rolling down her cheek. Grace immediately got up and hugged her. "Don't cry. Daddy says happy tears are good tears." Eli reached across the table and briefly squeezed Vivian's hand. His touch was warm and reassuring, and she found herself squeezing back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of warmth and laughter. Grace insisted on showing Vivian every stuffed animal in her collection. Eli made hot chocolate, and they all sat in the small living room while Grace read aloud from her favorite book, stumbling over the big words, but pressing on determinedly. When it was time to leave, Vivian found herself reluctant to go. Grace hugged her tightly, and even Eli gave her a gentle embrace that left her feeling oddly flustered. Driving home under a canopy of stars, Vivian felt different. Lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had lifted. She glanced at the empty passenger seat, where Thomas had sat so many times before his passing. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered into the quiet car, "I feel alive again, really alive." Her voice caught. "I think you'd like them. I think you'd want this for me." The stars twinkled overhead as she drove, and for the first time in years, the night felt full of possibility rather than loneliness. The morning sun painted Vivian's expansive backyard in golden light as she fussed over the elaborate picnic setup. She had spent hours arranging everything just right, a checkered blanket spread across the manicured lawn, fancy silver serving dishes that hadn't seen daylight in years, and cushions placed perfectly for comfort. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a crystal water glass for the 10th time. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, smoothing her casual silk blouse. "It's just a simple picnic." But deep down, she knew it was anything but simple. After the warmth of their dinner together, she needed to reciprocate, to show Eli and Grace a piece of her world. The doorbell chimed, making her jump. Taking a deep breath, she walked through her marble-floored foyer, her heels clicking against the polished stone. When she opened the door, Grace's beaming face greeted her first. "Miss Vivian?" Grace bounced on her toes, clutching a covered dish. "Daddy and I made potato salad." Eli stood behind his daughter, looking slightly uncomfortable in pressed khakis and a blue button-down shirt. "I hope we're not too early," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, gentle tone that always made Vivian's chest tighten. "You're right on time," Vivian smiled, stepping aside to let them in. "The backyard is through here." As they walked through her home, Vivian watched their reactions from the corner of her eye. Grace's mouth formed a perfect O as she stared at the crystal chandelier, while Eli maintained a respectful silence, though his eyes widened slightly at the obvious displays of wealth. When they stepped onto the back patio, Grace squealed with delight. "It's like a fairy tale picnic." She ran toward the blanket, then stopped short, suddenly remembering her manners. "Can I sit down, Miss Vivian?" "Of course, sweetheart." Vivian felt warmth spread through her chest at the child's enthusiasm. "In fact, you can help me arrange the food." Eli placed their potato salad among Vivian's carefully prepared dishes, cucumber sandwiches, fresh fruit, and various delicate pastries from her favorite bakery. His eyes fell on the sterling silver cutlery, and a small smile tugged at his lips. "You know," he said, picking up an ornate fork, "I think this has more tines than my entire cutlery drawer combined." Vivian felt her face flush, but then she caught the playful glint in his eye. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, surprising even herself. "Well, one must maintain standards," she replied with exaggerated primness, making Grace giggle. As they settled onto the blanket, the initial awkwardness melted away like morning frost in sunlight. Grace regaled them with stories about her school adventures, while Eli shared amusing tales from his daily work at the school. Vivian found herself laughing more than she had in years. And then Tommy's science project exploded, Grace explained, gesturing wildly with a half-eaten sandwich. Daddy had to clean green goo off the ceiling? That was quite a day, Eli chuckled, reaching for another deviled egg. Though I have to say, your fancy eggs here put my cleaning skills to shame, Vivian. The casual use of her first name sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. When had that happened? She couldn't remember exactly when they dropped the formality, but it felt right. A couple walking their dog along the sidewalk slowed down, staring at the unlikely trio on Vivian's lawn. Mrs. Henderson from next door actually stopped dead in her tracks, her pruning shears frozen mid-snip as she gaped at them over the hedge. Vivian felt a moment of self-consciousness, but then Grace offered her a strawberry with such innocent joy that everything else fell away. What did it matter? What others thought? Here, in this moment, she felt more genuine than she had in decades. They spent hours on that blanket, talking, laughing, and sharing stories. Grace taught them a clapping game she'd learned at school, which had Vivian fumbling through the sequences while Eli watched with barely contained amusement. Even the fancy silverware became a source of entertainment as Grace tried to guess the purpose of each specialized utensil, coming up with increasingly imaginative explanations. This one, she declared, holding up an olive fork, is definitely for combing a fairy's hair. As the afternoon light began to soften, they worked together to clean up. Grace carefully helped fold the blanket while Eli gathered the dishes. Vivian watched them move around her backyard with such natural ease, as if they belonged there. The sight stirred something deep within her, a longing she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Her fingers brushed against Eli's as they packed away the last of the silverware, and that simple touch sent warmth coursing through her. She caught his eye, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. In his gentle gaze, she saw possibilities she'd never dared to imagine before. Grace's voice broke the spell. "Can we do this again sometime, Miss Vivian? Pretty please?" Vivian turned to the little girl, her heart full to bursting. "I would love that, sweetheart." As they gathered their belongings, Vivian felt both lighter and heavier lighter with joy, yet weighted with the significance of what was happening. This simple picnic had shifted something fundamental in her world, and while the future seemed uncertain, it also felt full of promise. The crystal chandeliers of the Oak Ridge Country Club cast a warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests mingling in the grand dining room. Vivian Hawthorne smoothed her navy silk dress, her fingers brushing against the pearl necklace that had been her late husband's last gift to her. The familiar scents of expensive perfume and gourmet food filled the air, but somehow they felt different tonight, almost cloying. "Darling, we've barely seen you lately." Margaret Whitman, her longtime friend, drawled as she approached with a glass of champagne. "Where have you been hiding yourself?" Vivian accepted a flute from a passing waiter, buying time with a small sip. "I've been keeping busy with charity work at the elementary school." "Oh yes, we've heard all about your charitable endeavors." Catherine Preston joined them, her red lips curved in a knowing smirk. "Particularly with that janitor and his little girl." The champagne suddenly tasted bitter in Vivian's mouth. She fought to keep her expression neutral, years of social training taking over. "Eli Carter? He's quite helpful with the school programs." "Eli, is it?" Margaret's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "My dear, people are talking, and not in a good way." More of their social circle drifted over, drawn by the prospect of gossip. Vivian felt herself being boxed in, surrounded by predatory smiles and judgmental eyes. "A janitor, Vivian?" Barbara Miller shook her head. "I know you've been lonely since Charles passed, but surely you haven't become that desperate." Heat crept up Vivian's neck. "I don't know what you mean." "We've seen you with them," Catherine pressed. "At the grocery store, in your garden." "Really, Vivian, what would Charles think?" The mention of her late husband felt like a physical blow. Vivian's hand tightened around her champagne flute. "You're making something out of nothing?" she said, her voice growing brittle. "I'm simply overseeing some community projects. Someone needs to help these people." The words felt like acid on her tongue, but the approving nods from her peers spurred her on. "Of course, we all do our part for the less fortunate." Margaret patted her arm. "But there's no need to get so personally involved. It sets a strange precedent." "And that child," Barbara added, with a theatrical whisper, "I heard she's been calling you Mom." "Really, Vivian, you're encouraging inappropriate attachments. It's not kind to give them false hope." Vivian's chest tightened. The memory of Grace's sweet smile and trusting eyes flashed through her mind, making her stomach churn with guilt. But the weight of decades of social conditioning and peer pressure pressed down on her like a physical force. "Don't be ridiculous," she heard herself saying, her voice sharp and dismissive. "It's purely charitable work. I would never. I mean, really? A janitor?" She forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I have standards." The group chuckled appreciatively, and Vivian felt something inside her shrivel. The chandelier light suddenly seemed harsh and glaring rather than warm. "I'm so relieved to hear that," Catherine said. "We were worried you'd lost your mind. I mean, imagine the scandal. Vivian Hawthorne and a janitor." More laughter rippled through the group. Vivian raised her glass mechanically, playing along, when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. Her heart stopped. There, in the service entrance, stood Eli Carter. He wore a clean but simple uniform, clearly there to deliver or fix something for the venue. The look in his eyes told her he'd heard enough. Their gazes met for a brief moment. In his eyes, she saw not anger, but something worse, deep disappointment and hurt, mixed with a quiet dignity that made her want to sink through the floor. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his shoulders straight despite the burden she'd just placed on them. Vivian's champagne glass trembled in her hand. The sophisticated laughter around her transformed into something ugly and cruel. She felt sick, remembering the simple joy of their backyard picnic just hours ago, the way Grace had trustingly slipped her small hand into Vivian's, the gentle humor in Eli's eyes as he teased her about her fancy silverware, and she had just destroyed it all with a few casual, cruel words. The rest of the group had already moved on to other topics, satisfied they had put everything and everyone in their proper place. But Vivian stood frozen, the weight of what she'd done settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She watched the door where Eli had disappeared, willing him to come back so she could explain, apologize, take back her words. But she knew he wouldn't. In less than 5 minutes, she had confirmed his worst fears and justified his initial hesitation to let her into their lives. "More champagne, dear?" Margaret offered, oblivious to Vivian's distress. Vivian stared at her former friend as if seeing her for the first time, seeing all of them clearly, perhaps for the first time in decades. The perfectly coiffed hair, the designer clothes, the practiced smiles that never reached their eyes. Was this who she really was? Who she wanted to be? Her stomach twisted with nausea. Without a word, she set down her glass and turned toward the door, leaving behind the confused murmurs of her social circle. But she already knew it was too late. The damage was done. The last thing she saw before leaving the dining room was Eli's work truck pulling out of the parking lot, taking with it the warmth and authenticity she'd just begun to discover in her life. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eli's modest front yard as Vivian's Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as she stared at the small house with its neat flower beds and child's bicycle propped against the porch. The cheerful yellow curtains Grace had helped pick out seemed to mock her now. Vivian checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing the dark circles under her eyes that even expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. She hadn't slept at all after the disaster at the country club. The memory of Eli's wounded expression haunted her through the night. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of her car. Her heels clicked against the concrete pathway leading to the front door. The same path where, just days ago, she had walked with such easy comfort. Now, each step felt like lead. Before she could knock, the door opened. Eli stood there in his work uniform, his face carefully blank. The warmth that usually lit up his eyes when he saw her was gone, replaced by a guarded look that made her heart ache. "Eli," Vivian started, her carefully rehearsed speech deserting her. I need to explain about last night." "There's nothing to explain, Mrs. Hawthorne." His use of the formal address stung like a physical blow. "I understand perfectly." "No, please." She reached out, then let her hand fall when he subtly stepped back. "What you heard. I didn't mean any of it. I was weak and foolish, and I let them pressure me into saying things I don't believe." "Daddy?" Grace's voice called from inside. A moment later, she appeared beside her father, her face lighting up at the sight of Vivian. "Miss Vivian, are you coming in for breakfast? I helped make pancakes." The hope in Grace's voice made Vivian's eyes burn with tears. Eli placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder, keeping her from running to Vivian as she usually would. "Not today, sweetheart," he said softly. "Miss Hawthorne was just leaving." "But why?" Grace's lower lip trembled. "She always has breakfast with us on Saturdays now. She promised to help me with my reading." Vivian's throat tightened. "Grace, I'm so sorry. Grace." Eli interrupted firmly but kindly. "Why don't you go finish your breakfast? I need to talk to Miss Hawthorne for a minute." Grace looked between them, confusion and hurt evident on her young face. She moved to hug Vivian, but Eli's hand on her shoulder held her back. "Go on now, sweetie." Once Grace had reluctantly disappeared inside, Eli turned back to Vivian. His expression was composed, but she could see the pain beneath it. "I think it's best if we keep our relationship professional from now on. You were right last night. This was just charity work, wasn't it?" "No!" Vivian protested, her voice breaking. "Eli, please. These past weeks have meant everything to me. You and Grace. You've brought so much joy into my life." "Joy?" His quiet voice carried an edge of bitterness. "Is that what you told your friends last night? That spending time with the janitor and his daughter brought you joy? Or did you tell them what they wanted to hear? That you were just doing your charitable duty?" Each word hit her like a physical blow. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I was so wrong. Please don't let one moment of weakness erase everything we've shared." "That's just it, Mrs. Hawthorne," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't just one moment. It was who you really are when faced with a choice. When it mattered most, you chose your reputation over us, over Grace." The mention of Grace broke something inside Vivian. "She called me her second mom," she said brokenly. "How can I just walk away from her? From both of you? The same way you walked away from us last night." His words were quiet but final. "Goodbye, Mrs. Hawthorne. I'll make sure Grace understands." Somehow, the door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo in Vivian's ears. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the yellow curtains that now seemed to blur through her tears. From inside, she could hear Grace's muffled voice asking questions she couldn't make out. The drive home passed in a fog. Her mansion loomed before her, grand and empty. As she stepped into the marble foyer, the sound of her heels echoing off the high ceilings, the loneliness hit her with crushing force. Vivian made it to her living room before her legs gave out. She sank onto the pristine white sofa, not caring that her makeup was running with her tears. The room around her suddenly seemed grotesque in its opulence. All this space, all these expensive things, and not a trace of the warmth she'd found in Eli's modest home. "What have I done?" she whispered to the empty room. The truth she'd been dancing around for weeks finally broke through her carefully constructed walls. She loved him. She loved Eli Carter, with his quiet strength and gentle heart. She loved the way he looked at her when she helped Grace with her homework, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he made her feel like she was more than just her wealth and status. And she loved Grace, with her innocent affection and boundless enthusiasm. The little girl had worked her way into Vivian's heart so completely that the thought of never again hearing her excited chatter about school or feeling her warm hugs was almost unbearable. Vivian curled into herself on the sofa, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The evening sun slanted through her expensive curtains, painting patterns on the floor that reminded her of Grace's drawings on Eli's refrigerator. She had finally found real love, real family, and she had thrown it away for the approval of people who had never truly cared about her happiness. "I love him," she whispered through her tears, finally admitting the truth aloud. "I love them both." The confession echoed in the empty house, answered only by silence. 3 days had passed since Vivian's tearful realization in her empty mansion. The autumn wind whipped through the town streets, scattering golden leaves across sidewalks and lawns. Inside Riverside Elementary, the usual cheerful buzz of children's voices felt muted, especially in the third-grade classroom where Grace's desk sat empty. Mrs. Peterson, Grace's teacher, stood in the hallway during lunch break, her face drawn with worry as she spoke to another staff member. "Poor thing's been in the hospital since Tuesday. Some kind of severe respiratory infection." She shook her head, adjusting her reading glasses. Mr. Carter's beside himself, trying to manage it all. Vivian, who had come to drop off her weekly book donation, froze mid-step around the corner. Her heart clenched at the mention of Grace's name. She pressed herself against the wall, listening intently. "He's picking up extra night shifts at that warehouse, Mrs." Peterson continued. "Between the hospital bills and his regular expenses." She sighed heavily. "I heard him talking to the principal about taking out a loan." The words hit Vivian like physical blows. She clutched her designer handbag tighter, her knuckles white with tension. The image of Eli working himself to exhaustion, alone in his worry for Grace, made her throat tight with emotion. That evening, Vivian sat in her study, staring at the phone. She picked it up several times, only to set it down again. What right did she have to call after what she'd done? The memory of Eli's hurt expression at the dinner party still haunted her, but Grace's sweet face kept appearing in her mind, And finally, Vivian couldn't bear it anymore. She drove to St. Mary's Hospital, her usually confident steps faltering as she approached the pediatric ward. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled her nostrils, and the squeaking of nurses' shoes echoed off the mint-green walls. She asked for Grace's room number at the nurses' station, her voice barely above a whisper. Room 304 seemed to loom before her. Through the half-open door, she could see Eli slumped in an uncomfortable-looking chair, his work uniform wrinkled and his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Grace lay in the too-big hospital bed, her small frame dwarfed by white sheets and monitoring equipment. A nebulizer mask covered her face, and her chest rose and fell with visible effort. Vivian's heel clicked once against the linoleum floor, making Eli look up. His expression shifted from surprise to wariness, then to something unreadable. He straightened in his chair but didn't speak. Vivian began, then stopped. For once in her life, she didn't know what to say. I heard from Mrs. Peterson about Grace. Eli nodded slowly, his eyes moving back to his daughter. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the steady beeping of monitors. How is she? Vivian asked softly, taking one tentative step into the room. The doctors say she'll recover, Eli replied, his voice rough with fatigue. But she needs to stay here a few more days. The medication. He trailed off, running a hand over his face. Vivian moved closer, her heart aching at the dark circles under his eyes. When was the last time you slept properly? He gave a hollow laugh. I don't remember. Grace stirred then, her eyes fluttering open. Even sick, her face lit up when she saw Vivian. You came, she whispered through the mask, her voice weak but happy. Of course I did, sweetheart, Vivian replied, surprising herself with the tenderness in her voice. She glanced at Eli, seeking permission. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. Vivian pulled up another chair to Grace's bedside. She noticed a worn copy of The Secret Garden on the nightstand. Would you like me to read to you? Grace nodded eagerly, and Eli's posture relaxed slightly. Vivian picked up the book, opening to the marked page. Her voice, usually so practiced and controlled, softened naturally as she began to read. As the story unfolded, Grace's breathing seemed to ease. Her small hand found its way into Vivian's, and she held it gently, continuing to read. From the corner of her eye, she saw Eli fighting to stay awake. You should get some rest, she said quietly, pausing in her reading. I can stay with her for a while. I can't ask you to, he began. You're not asking, I'm offering. Vivian met his eyes. Please, Eli, let me help. He studied her face for a long moment, then looked at Grace, who had drifted into a peaceful sleep, her hands still clasped in Vivian's. The sight seemed to decide something for him. With visible reluctance, he stood. I'll just go get some coffee, he said, though they both knew he needed more than that. Take your time, Vivian assured him. We'll be fine. After Eli left, Vivian continued reading softly, even though Grace was asleep. The story filled the quiet room, mixing with the gentle sounds of medical equipment. Grace's small fingers twitched occasionally in Vivian's hand, and she squeezed back reassuringly each time. The sunset painted the hospital room in soft oranges and pinks when Eli returned, looking marginally more rested. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Vivian still reading, her free hand smoothing Grace's hair back from her forehead with a mother's gentle touch. The next chapter's about to start, Vivian said softly, looking up at him. Would you like to join us? Morning sunlight streamed through the hospital corridor windows as Vivian paced outside Grace's room. She hadn't slept much, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Eli was approaching with a cup of coffee, dark circles under his eyes. You're still here? He asked, surprise evident in his tired voice. Vivian smoothed her wrinkled blouse, nodding. I've been thinking all night, Eli. Please let me help. Not with money directly, but by organizing a fundraiser. The whole community would pitch in. Eli's shoulders tensed. Vivian, I appreciate the thought, but I can't accept. This isn't about you or me, Vivian interrupted gently. It's about Grace. She needs specialized treatment, and the community loves her. Let them help. She took a deep breath. I know I hurt you at that dinner party. My words were cruel and cowardly. But this isn't about making amends. It's about Grace. Through the window, they could see Grace sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling beneath the hospital blanket. The sight seemed to soften Eli's resolve. I don't want people's pity, he said quietly. It's not pity, Vivian assured him. It's love. Grace has touched so many hearts at school. The teachers, the other parents, her classmates. They all want to help. Eli ran a hand through his disheveled hair. What kind of fundraiser? Vivian's eyes lit up. A carnival at the school. Games, food, music, everything Grace loves. The teachers have already offered to volunteer, and I can coordinate with local businesses for donations. You've really thought this through, Eli said, a hint of warmth returning to his voice. I have. Vivian hesitated, then added softly, I care about her too, Eli, more than I ever expected to. He studied her face for a long moment. The morning sun caught the tears threatening to spill from her eyes, making them sparkle. Finally, he nodded. Okay, for Grace. For Grace, Vivian echoed. They began planning right there in the hospital corridor. Vivian pulled out her phone, making calls to the school principal, local business owners, and her connections in town. Eli contributed ideas about what Grace would love most, a face-painting station, her favorite music, carnival games she'd enjoy. As they worked together, the tension between them gradually eased. Their shared concern for Grace created a bridge over the hurt of recent days. Vivian noticed how Eli's voice softened when speaking about his daughter, how his eyes crinkled with hope when discussing the fundraiser plans. Mid-morning, a nurse came to check Grace's vitals. The little girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Daddy? She called weakly. Miss Vivian? They both moved to her bedside, one on each side. Grace's small hand reached for Vivian's, and she took it without hesitation. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Vivian asked, her voice tender. Tired, Grace mumbled, but better with you both here. Eli stroked his daughter's hair. We're planning a special carnival just for you, princess, when you're stronger. Grace's face lit up despite her fatigue. Really? With cotton candy? And face painting, Vivian added. And games with prizes. Will you both be there? Grace asked, looking between them. Vivian glanced at Eli across the bed. His eyes met hers, and she saw forgiveness beginning to bloom there. Yes, he said firmly. We'll both be there. Grace smiled and drifted back to sleep, still holding Vivian's hand. Neither adult moved to break the connection. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Grace sleep. The morning sun painted soft shadows across her peaceful face. In that moment, Vivian realized that whatever happened between her and Eli, their love for this precious child would always bind them together. Eli finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, Vivian. Not just for the fundraiser, but for being here, for caring about her. How could I not? Vivian whispered back. She's impossible not to love. They remained there, standing side by side at the hospital window, united in their devotion to the sleeping child who had changed both their lives. The morning light wrapped around them like a gentle embrace, promising hope for the days ahead. The community center buzzed with activity as volunteers hung colorful streamers and arranged folding chairs. Vivian stood in the middle of it all, clipboard in hand, directing people with the same authority she'd once reserved for charity galas. But this time, her heart beat differently. This wasn't about maintaining appearances. The silent auction items go along that wall, she called out, pointing to a row of tables. Local businesses had donated generously. Gift baskets, restaurant vouchers, even a weekend at the lakeside resort. Each time someone dropped off a donation, Vivian felt a surge of hope for Grace. Eli moved through the room quietly, setting up sound equipment borrowed from the school. He worked methodically, testing microphones and arranging speakers. While occasionally glancing at Vivian, their eyes met briefly across the room, and she offered a small smile, which he returned. Tentative, but warm. Mrs. Hawthorne? A young mother approached with a tray of homemade cookies. These are for the bake sale table. I heard about Grace from my daughter. They're in the same class. Thank you, Susan, Vivian said softly, touched by the gesture. More parents arrived with food, raffle items, and helping hands. The room slowly transformed into a celebration of community spirit. Throughout the morning, Vivian noticed how naturally Eli connected with everyone. He shared quiet words with worried parents, laughed with their children, and accepted help with graceful humility. It was so different from her world of polished small talk and calculated social moves. By early afternoon, the community center was packed. Families streamed in, dropping donations into collection boxes. Children ran around with face paint, and the aroma of home-cooked food filled the air. Vivian's wealthy friends were notably absent, but she found she didn't mind. It's time, whispered Sarah, the event coordinator, touching Vivian's arm. Vivian nodded, her throat suddenly dry. She hadn't prepared a speech. For once in her life, she would speak purely from her heart. The crowd quieted as Vivian took the microphone. She saw Eli standing at the back of the room, his expression unreadable. Taking a deep breath, she began. I want to tell you about the first time I met Eli Carter, she said, her voice clear and steady. It was at the mayor's charity gala. He asked me to dance, and She paused, feeling the weight of the memory. I dismissed him cruelly, simply because he was a janitor. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eli's eyes widened slightly. The very next night, my car broke down on Old Mill Road. Dozens of cars passed me by, but only one person stopped to help. Vivian's voice grew softer. It was Eli. He fixed my car and asked for nothing in return, even after how I'd treated him. She gripped the microphone tighter. I've spent my life judging people by their titles, their bank accounts, their social status. But Eli, and his beautiful daughter Grace, taught me what true wealth looks like. It's in the way he works tirelessly to give his daughter a good life. It's in how he treats everyone with respect, regardless of how they treat him. It's in his quiet strength and unwavering integrity. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she continued. Grace is sick now, and she needs our help. But this isn't just about raising money. It's about recognizing the best among us, not the wealthiest or most powerful, but those who show us what real character means. I was wrong about Eli Carter. We all were. She looked directly at him now. He's not just a janitor. He's a father who would move mountains for his daughter. He's a man who stops to help strangers on dark roads. He's someone who makes our community better just by being part of it. The room had grown completely still. Even the children were quiet. I'm standing here today asking for your help, Vivian said, her voice thick with emotion. Not out of pity, but because Grace deserves every chance at health and happiness. And because her father has given so much to all of us, whether we noticed it or not. When she finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then, someone started clapping. The applause spread through the room like a wave, growing louder and stronger. People began moving toward the donation tables with determined purpose. Vivian stepped down from the stage, her legs shaky. Through the crowd, she saw Eli making his way toward her. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. They met in a quiet corner of the room. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eli reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The simple words carried the weight of forgiveness, of understanding, of something deeper neither was ready to name. Vivian squeezed back, unable to speak. In that touch, in that moment, walls crumbled, pride dissolved. They stood together, watching as their community rallied around them, united in purpose and compassion. The noise of the fundraiser continued around them, but in their corner, time seemed to pause. In Eli's eyes, Vivian saw not judgment for her past mistakes, but appreciation for her present courage. And in that quiet exchange of looks, both felt the first stirrings of healing, not just for Grace, but for themselves as well. Sunshine streamed through the hospital window, casting a warm glow on Grace's sleeping face. Her breathing had improved significantly since starting the new treatment 3 days ago. The harsh wheezing that had worried them all was slowly giving way to the gentle rise and fall of easier breaths. Vivian sat in the chair beside Grace's bed, her designer clothes replaced by comfortable jeans and a soft sweater. She held a worn copy of Charlotte's Web in her hands, her voice gentle as she read aloud. Grace's favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Buttons, lay tucked under her arm. "Just one more chapter," Grace whispered sleepily, her eyes fighting to stay open. "You need your rest, sweetheart," Vivian said, marking the page with a bookmark Grace had made her, a simple strip of construction paper decorated with crooked hearts and glitter. Eli appeared in the doorway, his work uniform dusty from his shift at the school. Despite his obvious exhaustion, his eyes held hope as he looked at his daughter's improving condition. "How's our girl doing?" he asked softly, moving to stand beside Vivian. "The doctor says her numbers are better today," Vivian replied, unconsciously reaching for his hand. She ate almost all of her lunch. Over the next week, Grace's recovery continued steadily. When she was finally released from the hospital, Vivian naturally fell into helping with her care. She'd arrive at their modest house each morning, armed with groceries and determination. The kitchen, once barely used by the busy single father, came alive with the sense of homemade soups and fresh-baked cookies. Vivian discovered she had a knack for cooking, though her first attempts often ended with good-natured teasing from both Grace and Eli about burned edges and too much salt. "You're getting better," Eli assured her one afternoon as she stirred a pot of chicken noodle soup. "At least this batch doesn't look like mud." Vivian playfully swatted at him with a dish towel. "I'll have you know, this recipe came from my grandmother." Poor grandmother. Grace giggled from her spot at the kitchen table, where she was working on homework. The days fell into a comfortable routine. Vivian would help Grace with her schoolwork while Eli was at work. then tackle the mounting laundry or dusty shelves. She found an unexpected satisfaction in these simple tasks, so different from her former life of charity galas and social obligations. One evening, as autumn painted the trees golden, Vivian arrived to find Eli struggling with a broken washing machine. Without hesitation, she knelt beside him on the laundry room floor, holding a flashlight while he worked. "You don't have to do all this," he said quietly, looking at her with something deeper than gratitude in his eyes. "I want to," she replied simply, and meant it. The house transformed gradually under her care. Fresh curtains appeared in the windows, bright flowers in simple vases brought color to rooms, and the pantry stayed consistently stocked. But more than the physical changes, the home filled with laughter and warmth. Grace's strength returned fully as weeks passed. Soon she was running through the house again, her illness becoming a fading memory. Yet Vivian remained, her presence no longer needed but deeply wanted. She taught Grace to bake cookies, flour dusting their faces as they giggled together. She helped Eli organize his bills and paperwork, offering quiet support without judgment. Their lives intertwined naturally, like streams flowing into a river. One Tuesday evening, as autumn's chill crept through the windows, they sat around the kitchen table. Vivian had prepared a simple meal of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, finally mastered after several failed attempts. Grace chatted about her day at school, her hands animated as she described her art project. Eli watched them both, his eyes soft with emotion. When Grace paused to take a breath, he cleared his throat gently. "Vivian," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her look up from her plate. "I need to tell you something." Grace fell quiet, sensing the importance of the moment. "These past weeks," Eli continued, "watching you with Grace, seeing how naturally you fit into our lives." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You've become part of our family. I don't know if that was what you intended when you first helped us, but that's what's happened." Vivian felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked at their faces, Grace's bright smile and Eli's gentle gaze. The kitchen's warm light embraced them all, and in that moment, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. "Thank you," Eli said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Thank you for becoming part of our family." Grace bounced in her chair, unable to contain her joy. "Does this mean you'll stay forever?" The question hung in the air, full of hope and possibility. But Vivian didn't answer immediately. Instead, she squeezed Eli's hand in return and smiled at Grace, letting the comfortable warmth of belonging wash over her. The October morning sparkled with dew as Eli and Vivian walked through the school garden, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. The garden had changed since their first meeting here. Summer's bright blooms had given way to autumn's rich colors, chrysanthemums nodding their russet heads in the gentle breeze. Vivian pulled her cardigan closer, watching Eli from the corner of her eye. He moved with the same quiet grace she'd noticed that first day, his hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed in his familiar work shirt. The morning sun caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and her heart skipped. "Remember when we planted these?" she asked, touching a marigold that still stubbornly bloomed. "I had no idea what I was doing." Eli chuckled, the sound warming the crisp air. "You kept asking if you were burying them too deep, but look, they turned out just fine." They paused by the wooden bench where they'd once shared lunch, Grace chattering between them about her science project. The memory hung sweet in the air. "Things have a way of growing when you least expect them to," Vivian said softly, her fingers tracing the bench's weathered grain. Eli turned to face her, his expression intense. "Vivian, I need to tell you something." She held her breath, watching as he struggled to find the words. The morning breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of earth and autumn leaves. "When you first came into our lives," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I thought you were just another wealthy woman looking for a charity case. But then, you started showing up. Really showing up. Not just for the big moments, but for the small ones too." Vivian's eyes stung with sudden tears. "Eli, you taught Grace how to braid her hair," he continued, taking a step closer. "You learned to cook soup from scratch when she was sick. You fold laundry like it's the most natural thing in the world, sitting on my old couch with mismatched socks in your lap." His hand found hers, warm and work roughened. "I've watched you change, Vivian. But more than that, I've watched myself fall in love with you, piece by piece, day by day." The words hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying. Vivian's heart thundered in her chest as tears spilled onto her cheeks. "I tried so hard not to," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was so afraid of what people would think, of what it meant for my carefully ordered life. But then Grace got sick, and nothing else mattered except being there with you both." She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. I love the way you hum when you're fixing things. I love how you always have a Band-Aid in your pocket for scraped knees. I love your patience, your kindness, your quiet strength. Her free hand reached up to touch his face, fingers trembling. I love you, Eli Carter, not despite who you are, but because of it. Because you showed me what really matters. Eli's eyes shone with emotion as he drew her closer. The morning sun painted everything in gold as he lowered his head, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that felt like coming home. Vivian melted into him, her hands sliding up to his shoulders as his arms wrapped around her waist. The sound of running footsteps broke them apart. Grace bounded toward them, her backpack bouncing, her face lit with joy. I knew it, she crowed, launching herself at them both. I knew you loved each other. Eli caught her with practiced ease, lifting her between them. Vivian wrapped her arms around them both, breathing in the scent of Grace's strawberry shampoo and Eli's clean soap. They stood together in the morning light, surrounded by the garden where their story began, 3 hearts beating in perfect harmony. Grace wiggled happily in their embrace. Are we a family now? She asked, her eyes bright with hope. Eli and Vivian exchanged glances over her head, their eyes full of love and promise. The garden around them whispered with possibilities, and the morning sun blessed them with its golden light. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of First Community Church, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. Vivian smoothed her silk dress, her heart fluttering as she, Eli, and Grace approached the church entrance. She hadn't attended services in months, not since her husband's passing, but today felt different. Today, she wasn't walking in alone. Grace skipped between them, her patent leather shoes clicking on the steps, her Sunday dress swishing around her knees. Look at all the pretty windows, she exclaimed, pointing up at the colored glass. Eli squeezed Vivian's hand gently. You okay? He whispered, his eyes warm with concern. Vivian nodded, though her throat felt tight. Just nervous, she admitted quietly. As they stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the familiar scent of old hymnals and furniture polish wrapped around them. The organist was playing softly, and the sanctuary buzzed with pre-service conversation. But as they made their way down the center aisle, the buzz faded to whispers. Vivian felt the stares. Mrs. Peterson's perfectly penciled eyebrows shot up. The Thompson sisters bent their gray heads together, murmuring behind their bulletins. Even Pastor Roberts paused in his conversation, though his expression remained kind. Grace, oblivious to the attention, tugged at Eli's sleeve. Can we sit in the front, please, Daddy? Middle is fine, sweetie, Eli answered, guiding them to an empty pew halfway down the aisle. He let Grace in first, then Vivian, before taking his seat beside her. More whispers floated around them. Isn't that Vivian Hawthorne? With the school janitor? Did you hear? Vivian's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high. She'd expected this, had prepared herself for it. Still, the reality stung more than she'd anticipated. Then she felt Eli's warm hand cover hers where it rested on the hymnal. Without hesitation, she laced her fingers through his, holding on firmly. Let them look, she thought. Let them see. Grace opened her children's Bible, pointing out pictures to both of them. Look, she whispered loudly. That's Jesus feeding all those people with just a little bit of food. A few rows behind them, someone tittered, but then a warm, wavering voice rose above the whispers. Well, bless my soul if it isn't young Eli Carter. Mrs. Margaret Davis, one of the church's oldest members, stood beside their pew, her white hair neatly curled and her kind face creased with a genuine smile. She taught Sunday school for 40 years before retiring, and everyone knew her opinion carried weight. Mrs. Davis. Eli stood respectfully, but she waved him back down. Sit, sit. And this must be your Grace, how you've grown. She beamed at the little girl before turning her twinkling eyes to Vivian. And Vivian Hawthorne, it does my heart good to see you back in church. These pews have missed you. Vivian felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness in the old woman's voice. You 3 make such a lovely family, Mrs. Davis continued, patting Vivian's shoulder. The Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? Sometimes he knows better than we do what our hearts need. The warmth of her words seemed to spread through the sanctuary. The whispers died down. Mr. Peterson leaned forward to shake Eli's hand. The Thompson sisters offered tentative smiles. As Mrs. Davis made her way to her usual seat, other congregation members stopped by their pew. The Miller family, whose daughter was in Grace's class, shared genuine greetings. Even Mrs. Peterson came over, her initial surprise softening into something like approval. The organ swelled with the opening hymn, and the congregation rose. Grace stood between them, holding her children's hymnal upside down but singing with enthusiasm. Eli's deep voice joined the melody, steady and sure beside her. Vivian closed her eyes, letting the familiar music wash over her. The words of Amazing Grace filled the sanctuary, and she felt the truth of them deep in her soul. How precious did that grace appear! She thought of her own pride, her prejudices, the walls she'd built around her heart, and how they'd crumbled in the face of true love. The morning light streamed through the stained glass, warming her face. Grace leaned against her side, still singing. Eli's hand remained firmly in hers. In that moment, surrounded by music and acceptance, Vivian felt a peace she hadn't known in years. This was what mattered. Not the whispers, not the social circles, not the opinions of others. What mattered was the love that had found her when she least expected it, the family that had welcomed her with open hearts, and the grace that had given her a second chance at happiness. The hymn soared to its final verse, voices rising in harmony. Vivian opened her eyes to find Eli watching her, his gaze full of understanding and affection. Grace swayed between them, her small hand reaching up to hold Vivian's free one. As the last notes faded, Vivian squeezed both their hands, grateful beyond words for the love that had proven stronger than pride, for the family she'd found, and for the courage to choose happiness over appearances. The whispers had faded to nothing, replaced by the simple truth of their togetherness. Pastor Robert stepped up to the pulpit, his warm smile encompassing the entire congregation. "Let us pray," he began, and as heads bowed throughout the sanctuary, Vivian felt nothing but gratitude fill her heart. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Eli's modest home, warming the living room with a gentle golden glow. The aroma of fresh-baked bread and homemade stew filled the air as neighbors gathered around the extended dining table. Vivian stood in the kitchen, her designer dress replaced by a simple apron, stirring a pot of her first-ever attempt at chocolate pudding. "Need any help there?" Mrs. Henderson from next door called out, her kind eyes twinkling. She had been one of the first neighbors to welcome Vivian without judgment. "I think I've almost got it," Vivian replied, laughing as she lifted the spoon. "Though I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be cooking instead of hiring caterers. Those days seem like a lifetime ago, don't they?" Eli appeared beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. His touch still sent warmth through her heart. The small dining room buzzed with conversation as their guests settled in. Mr. Peterson, the retired mailman, sat next to Grace, listening intently as she explained her latest art project. The Rodriguez family from across the street had brought their famous enchiladas, and even Miss Wilson, the local librarian, who had initially been skeptical of their relationship, was chatting happily with the others. "Dinner's ready," Vivian announced, carrying the steaming pot to the table. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the weight, but from the overwhelming joy of this simple moment. Just months ago, she would have scoffed at such an informal gathering. Now, she couldn't imagine anything more perfect. "This looks amazing," Sarah from the school PTA commented, helping to pass the dishes around. "Who would have thought our Mrs. Hawthorne could cook?" "Well, Eli's been teaching me," Vivian admitted, sharing a loving glance with him, "though I still burn the toast most mornings." Laughter rippled around the table, warm and genuine. These people had become more than neighbors. They were family. The kind of family that grew from love and acceptance rather than social status or obligation. As they enjoyed their meal, Grace fidgeted in her seat, clearly bursting with excitement about something. She kept looking at Vivian, then giggling and whispering to Mr. Peterson, who nodded encouragingly. "Grace, sweetie, do you have ants in your pants?" Eli teased, noticing his daughter's restlessness. "Can I give it to her now, Daddy, please?" Grace bounced in her chair, her eyes sparkling. Eli nodded, and Grace jumped up, running to her room. She returned, clutching something behind her back, approaching Vivian with an expression of pure joy. "I made this for you," Grace announced, presenting a handmade card decorated with glitter, stickers, and carefully drawn hearts. The words on the front read, "To my second mom," in wobbly rainbow letters. Vivian's hands shook as she opened the card. Inside, in Grace's best handwriting, it said, "Thank you for being my second mom. I love you lots and lots. Love, Grace." The room fell quiet as Vivian stared at the card, tears welling in her eyes. She looked at Grace's hopeful face, then at Eli, who watched them both with love and pride. "Oh, Grace," Vivian whispered, opening her arms. Grace flew into them, hugging her tight. "This is the most beautiful gift I've ever received." The neighbors dabbed at their own eyes, touched by the moment. Mrs. Henderson reached over to squeeze Vivian's hand, while Mr. Peterson cleared his throat gruffly, trying to hide his emotion. "I think this calls for a toast," Eli said, rising from his chair. He lifted his glass of sparkling cider, looking around at their gathered friends. "To new beginnings," he announced, his voice full of emotion, "built on love, not pride." "To new beginnings," everyone echoed, raising their glasses. The evening continued with shared desserts and stories, children playing in the corner while adults talked and laughed. As the sky darkened outside, neighbors began to say their goodbyes, each leaving with warm hugs and promises to gather again soon. After the last guest departed, Vivian, Eli, and Grace sat at the kitchen table, now cleared, except for 3 cups of hot cocoa. The warm glow of the overhead lamp cast a cozy circle of light around them. Grace's card stood proudly displayed on the windowsill, catching the lamplight and making the glitter sparkle. They held hands around the table, a simple gesture that felt sacred in its ordinariness. Grace's small fingers intertwined with theirs, her face glowing with contentment. Eli's strong, work-worn hand held Vivian's gently, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken love and gratitude. Vivian looked at their joined hands, her manicured fingers linked with Eli's calloused ones, and Grace's small, paint-stained hand. The sight brought fresh tears to her eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. They sat there in the warm lamplight, 3 hearts that had found their way to each other despite all odds. Their smiles reflected the deep peace of knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be, together, whole, and complete at last. Grace's head nodded slightly, her eyes growing heavy with sleep, but her grip on their hands remained steady. Eli caught Vivian's eye over their daughter's head, his face full of love and contentment. Vivian smiled back, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. In this simple kitchen, under the gentle glow of the lamp, they were more than 3 individuals. They were a family. The warmth of their joined hands, the sound of their quiet breathing, and the love that filled the space between them created a moment of perfect harmony. It was everything Vivian had never known she needed, everything Eli had hoped to find again, and everything Grace had wished for in her innocent prayers. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Vivian Hawthorne, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.